What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today I figured we'd talk about another super cool list that did really well in a grand tournament. Today we're going to be talking about the Gibraltar Grand Tournament and TacticalTortoise's Thousand Suns list, pure Thousand Suns that went 5-1 in this 6-round event. This is really impressive because Thousand Suns are still awaiting their new codex, although it is just a couple weeks away, which is super exciting, but in the meantime, they are looking a little bit sad. Although Taraxer is still able to pull out a 5-1 finish with them, doing really well with this slightly non-standard, a little bit underpowered codex. Now, first off, we talk a little bit about the Gibraltar GT, the event that this list played at. It ended up being a 60-player event running 6 rounds, obviously held in Gibraltar. And it did have a special rule that armies could only be drawn from a single codex, meaning that no souped armies were allowed, which is a particular downside to most of these Chaos sub-factions. The event was run by SN Battle Reports. If you're familiar with them, go check their channel out. They do some really high-quality, good-looking content, and they love this style of special rule. Now, in total fairness, all of the most powerful factions in the game right now are designed to be played as a mono faction and not as a souped list, so I don't think that's actually that big of a deal in the current meta, but it's still worth mentioning because it is a non-standard metagame. Now, I do want to mention as well that if you want access to this list and a lot of other tournament lists, we're actually compiling a database of lists over on the Discount Games Incorporated website. This video isn't sponsored by Discount Games or anything, but in the spirit of full disclosure, I will say that I am helping them compile this database of lists. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking top placers from GTs and other large events all around the world and just compiling them in a searchable format. You can check them out over at discountgamesinc.com/tournaments, and you can actually find tournament lists from almost every miniature game system available, and you can actually search through all of them, whether you want to search via faction or even particular units that are being played. All of those, you can just enter it in the search bar, and you'll be able to find any list that matches those parameters. So anyway, taking a look at Taraxer's Thousand Suns list here. It's a little bit of a weird one, although we do see some classic combinations. It's a single battalion detachment out of Cult of Duplicity, so all of the sorcerers in this detachment are going to get access to Sorceress Facade. Basically just a cult targeting teleport that places the unit anywhere on the table, outside of 9 inches of enemies. It is almost identically Gate of Infinity out of the Grey Knights Codex, and there are some units that can make really good use of that in this list. We're starting with Ahriman on a disc. He's bringing Warp Time, as well as Death Hex and Weaver of Fates. We have a Demon Prince with the Helm of the Third Eye for some CP regeneration, bringing Prescience and Duplicitous Tactician to allow him to redeploy units before the game starts. That's another benefit of coming out of that Cult of Duplicity. Now, the big kicker in the list is the Rubric Marine Bomb, 20 Rubric Marines with 2 Soul Reaper cannons. And generally speaking, the combination here is that you can use Risen Rubricae before the game starts to forward deploy this unit as if they had concealed positions, essentially, placing outside of 9 inches of enemy models and the enemy deployment zone. That, if you win the roll to go first, allows your Rubric Marines to stand still and use Infernal Fusillade to double tap all of their bolt guns. That puts out an immense amount of damage, especially in conjunction with Veterans of the Long War, and gives this list an absolutely devastating alpha strike. That's a combination that's been used in Thousand Suns and mixed chaos lists for the last couple of months, ever since Psychic Awakening came out, and it's been great. If you do go first, this unit does a ridiculous amount of damage if your opponent has any exposed units. With that Cult of Duplicity, if you don't go first, you can just use that Duplicitous Tactician to deploy them safely back in your deployment zone. The downside is that you do have to spend the CP on Risen Rubricae regardless of whether or not you go first, but that's the only downside. It does require your opponent to deploy with the knowledge of that Risen Rubricae in mind, deploy very conservatively, otherwise if they lose that roll, they're going to get destroyed. So you do get a little bit of a benefit from that, and then you get to place the Marines back in your deployment zone if you need to, and use Sorceress Facade to teleport them up the table later if you want to get them up in the fight. We also have a couple other utility units in the list, a unit of Rubric Marines, as well as a Zangor unit, 10 Zangors with their little blades. In the elite slot, things get interesting. We have the classic Chaos Contemptor with twin Volkite Culverins and a Cyclone Missile Launcher. Kind of need this guy right now. The firepower is immense. It's just such a solid gun platform that it's hard to leave home without it. We also have a Chaos Leviathan Dreadnought with Gravflex Bombards. Now this guy, if you haven't seen it before, can put out an immense amount of 3+ damage shooting, especially against high armor save targets. Each Gravflex Bombard innately fires 2d3 Strength 8 AP3, 2 flat damage attacks. However, it has the grav roll where it will gain an additional damage if you are shooting at something with a save characteristic of 3 or better, which means this guy's putting out 4d3 strength 8 3 flat damage shots, which is pretty phenomenal. The big downside is that the gun's only 24-inch range. However, Chaos can supplement that pretty easily. Obviously, you have access to warp time in the faction from Ahriman, one of the most reliable warp times in the game with his +1 to cast, but you could also Sorcerer's Facade him too because he has Cult of Duplicity. That gives you the ability to hit basically anything on the table with this big bombard shot. In conjunction with the Risen Rubricate combo, if this Thousand Suns list goes first, it's going to be able to put an enormous amount of pressure on its opponent from the top of turn 1. We also have a Zongor Shaman with a Dark Matter Crystal, probably to teleport those Zangors around so you can get some objectives secured around the table wherever you need to, but that is another access to a reliable teleport on the Rubric Marines if you need it as well. In the fast attack slot, we actually have some interesting choices. A unit of Zangor Enlightened. These guys are bringing their Divining Spears, which makes them Strength 6 in combat. On the charge, Strength 6 is a pretty good breakpoint to be at, given there's a lot of Toughness 6 and Toughness 3 in the metagame right now. But I imagine the reason these guys are in the list is so that they can perform actions and act as a utility unit. They can run around and use that movement of 12 to score maneuver-style secondaries like Engage in All Fronts pretty reliably. Lastly, we have 2 units of 5 Chaos Spawn, which kind of came out of left field for me. I do really like Chaos Spawn. They're an incredibly efficient profile, but I haven't really seen them in large numbers. But once you dig into their datasheet, it makes a lot of sense. 23 points for 4 wounds at toughness 5 is not that bad, especially if they get the correct D3 result on their Mutated Beyond Reason ability in melee and can deal some significant damage. That feels like a pretty good trade-off. A lot of times you see Chaos Spawn in singletons just to act as utility models and screen out backline objectives and sit on objectives and stuff like that, but in this case, being beasts, they can go through walls, so that large unit size doesn't make a huge difference, and you can use all of those abilities to move them around the table just like the rest of the list. You can use Warp Time to double move them, you can use Sorcerer's Facade to teleport them up the table, because hilariously, the Cults of the Legion ability only excludes cultists and Zangors from gaining cult keywords. It doesn't exclude Spawn, so these are some very duplicitous Chaos Spawn we have today. So overall, for 230 points, you get a grand total of 40 wounds at toughness 5 with a reasonable melee profile. Base speed 7 on a beast body is not super fast, but you are Thousand Suns, so if anybody's going to get it up the table, it's probably them. So I absolutely don't hate this pick. It makes a ton of sense. Last, but certainly not least, we actually have a bunch of points set aside for summoning. The list only comes out to 1732 points, which means we do have about 270 points to spend to bring some demons in during the course of the game. Super interesting list, a little bit non-standard from what we see. So let's talk about all of the games that this list played during the tournament and the opponents that it faced. Round 1, this list was able to get through Adeptus Sororitas, bringing a single Bloody Rose detachment, so not the multi-detachment, multi-order style that we typically see. That was bringing an MSU build, running 3 units of Sisters Repentia, as well as 2 units of Arcoflagellants, 2 Zephyrim squads, and 3 Retributor squads. We did have 2 Sororitas Rhinos to keep those things in, but that's not enough to protect all of these light infantry, so I imagine that there is the potential that that Rubric Bomb, or some Rubrics coming out of an unexpected corner, with that Sorcerer's Facade could deal significant damage to these Light Sisters infantry. That was a relatively low scoring, but absolutely resounding win, 65-42, going to the Thousand Suns. In round 2, this list lost to one of the other eventual finalists of the event, going down to Adeptus Mechanicus, a very standard Adeptus Mechanicus plane-focused list, bringing all Mars detachments, featuring 2 Bricks of Scutarii Rangers, a unit of Taraxii Sterilizers, some Cerberus Raiders, 4 planes in 2 Archaeopter Fusilavs and 2 Stratoraptors, as well as 3 Iron Strider Ballastarii, and support units to follow up. Adeptus Mechanicus are very much the boogeyman right now, and definitely one of the most powerful armies we've seen in a long time in Warhammer 40k. So it should never be a surprise when a list goes down to them, especially since those Archaeopter Fusilavs are almost the perfect unit to counter a unit like that Rubric Bomb. Rubric Marines tend to rely on their invulnerable saves and pretty resilient defensive profile to keep them alive. The downside is that being still 1 wound Marines, they will go down to mortal wounds very quickly, and those planes being able to roll 10d6 and dealing mortal wounds on a 4+ means they rip half of that unit off the table before it really gets to do anything. Unfortunate about the matchup, but there's not much else you can do about that. Round 3, we saw the list play against Drukhari, running a real space raid detachment using Dark Technomancers and focusing on Chronos in order to use their flamer weapons to trigger Dark Technomancers. The list had the 3 required characters on Archon, Homunculus, and Succubus, a unit of Hecatrix Blood Brides, 1 unit of Campbellite Warriors, and 3 units of Rax, as well as 3 units of 5 Incubi, 2 units of 10 Hellions, 6 Chronos, and 4 Raiders, following things up. Now, this list does seem pretty adept at fighting against Drukhari. If that Rubric Bomb is able to go off, that's an immense amount of firepower that's really good at dealing with Drukhari profiles, and especially some small interactions like the Chaos Leviathan Dreadnought firing an immense number of blasting 2 damage attacks, meaning that those Hellions, once they get stuck in, will be removed relatively quickly. The final score looks pretty close, a 52-47 win for the Thousand Suns, but it does make sense to me that this would be a relatively tuned list that would be good at fighting Drukhari. Round 4 was not so close, however, as we saw the army go up against a pure Imperial Knights housed Krast detachment, bringing 2 Armiger Helverins, 2 Warglaves, a Knight Warden, and 2 Knight Megaras. This is where I imagine the maneuverability of the army and the ability to throw that Chaos Leviathan Dreadnought really anywhere you need to absolutely came into play. That would give the Chaos player total control over where they're able to engage those Knights from, which is a really big deal considering that Knights are affected pretty negatively by the obscuring keyword. You can target them through obscuring terrain, but they can't innately target you back, meaning that if you're able to Sorceress Facade that Chaos Leviathan Dreadnought into an annoying position behind a wall somewhere with a window through it, you could just be firing your Gravflux Bombards at those Knights, dealing a boatload of 3 damage attacks without them having the ability to reciprocate. In addition, if you go first, especially with that Rubric Marine Bomb, they can just deal an immense amount of damage to a Knight with an immense number of high volume, pretty reasonable attacks, especially with Veterans of the Long War in play, without really any ability to screen out those Sorcerer's Facades or the Risen Rubricae. That unit can start up right out in the front of the army, potentially go first, and dunk a bunch of damage onto a Knight with that +1 to wound and the double tap. In addition, with the number of utility and small OBSEC units the army has, they can really play around Knight's issue holding scenario points, and the ability to Sorcerer's Facade those small units really wherever you need them is a really big deal. That ended up being a resounding win for the Thousand Suns, 97-20. Moving on to the penultimate round, the list had another very close game, this time against Space Wolves, running a double patrol, bringing a Librarian, Primaris Chaplain, 1 unit of Incursors, as well as some Thunderwolf Cavalry, and Long Fangs with Multi-Meltas, following that up with additional Long Fangs, as well as Wolf Guard, more Thunderwolf Cavalry, and a drop pod to deliver the Long Fangs. If you've watched my videos at all, you know I don't think very highly of Thunderwolf Cavalry, and I imagine that they were probably removed pretty quickly, although the high number of Grav Cannon attacks in this army does make things a little bit awkward. Because of the base 3+ save on the Rubric Marines, the Grav Cannons do go to 2 damage, and that does mean that they shoot through Allah's Dust on that big Risen Rubricae bomb. So especially if those Long Fangs are able to go first, drop in with the 2 Grav Cannon units and dump an enormous number of shots, ignoring the armor save buff on that big Rubricae unit. That could mean a lot of dead Rubric Marines right off the bat. Still, the Thousand Suns were able to take it down in a very low-scoring game, 43-36. That moved this list onto the final game against yet another Drukhari army. This one, a little bit non-standard, bringing a Distillers of Fear Homunculus Covenant detachment, as well as a Cult of the Cursed Blade Witch Cult detachment with 2 units of 10 Witches, and last but not least, the standard Cabal of the Black Heart detachment, bringing all the Raiders. A little different from what we normally see, which is typically Cult of Strife, but there are definitely some upsides to bringing Curse the Blade on your Witches. Gives them +1 strength, which is pretty solid, and they're able to reflect mortal wounds onto their opponents with save rolls of 6+. With everything in that detachment having an invulnerable save, that means that you get a lot of chances to ping your opponent for additional damage, and it ends up being very annoying to play against, especially with the larger units, for example, those units of 10 Witches. I like that this list was playing around a little bit with some different factions that we normally see, but like we talked about before, I do think that a lot of Chaos archetypes, and especially this Thousand Suns Rubric Marine Bomb, if it's able to go first, it does have a good profile into a lot of the important units in a Drukhari army, and with that double tap, we'll probably be able to chew through them. That was another relatively close game, this time 58 to 53 in favor of the Thousand Suns. Now, it's important to note, a lot of these games were incredibly close, and a lot of them were very low scoring, which means I think the gameplay was probably very technical on the part of the Thousand Suns. I imagine they did a lot of teleporting and charging onto objectives to deny points and things like that, and ending up trading attrition for the ability to deny their opponents the victory points. Obviously, that worked out for them, going on a 5-1 record. However, with relatively low-scoring games, that also meant that it put the list down relatively low in the standings, only coming in the top 6. That said, in a tournament dominated by 3 of the 4 big boogeyman factions in the metagame right now, those being Dark Angels, Drukhari, and Adeptus Mechanicus, it is still very impressive that a pure Thousand Suns list, not even running Magnus, was able to go 5-1 and secure a top 8 placing. So congratulations to Taraxer for this outstanding performance with Thousand Suns. And I hope this gives all those forlorn Thousand Suns players something to think about while they await their shiny new codex coming out in just a couple weeks. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for watching. I just want to give one more quick shout out to discountgamesinc.com/tournaments, the tournament database that we're currently compiling and includes this Thousand Suns list. I also want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the channel over on patreon.com/tacticaltortoise or on the YouTube membership that you can join down below. We do have some new advanced tactics videos coming out that you can get access to this week if you join up to those 2 platforms. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. Have a good one. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.